Hello everybody, Michael here with Glossika. Today I'm just going to present mastering the tones in any Asian language. As you may know, many languages in East Asia and Southeast Asia are tonal, and these present special problems for the language learner. So I'm the founder of Glossika, a language learning site. We use machine learning and AI to help our learners learn languages through sentences. So our premise is basically to achieve fluency efficiently. And my talk today is mastering the tones in Asian languages. So first, we're going to just go over three things. I'm going to be talking about the syllable and tonogenesis. Now, tonogenesis just means how tones started in a language, because languages originally that did not have tone and became tonal over time, and there are languages going through that process now, we call that tonogenesis. The second thing I'm going to talk about are universal metatones and give you some examples across languages, the kind of contours and number of tone, how you count the tones in languages, and then finally how those tones have evolved in Mandarin. And the third thing we're going to do is we're going to practice the tones in Mandarin and show you how to do that. So first, let's take a look at the syllable. Generally speaking, the syllable structure is consonant, glide, vowel, glide, consonant, with only the central vowel as being the most essential part of the syllable. Originally, going back in time, consonant clusters could appear at the end and at the beginning of words. And some writing systems actually still display this. For example, Tibetan is also within this Sprachraum, and in the Sino-Tibetan language family, the same language family as Chinese. So you will see these consonant clusters in Tibetan, still written in Tibetan, although they're not necessarily spoken that way anymore. Since Tibetan has lost those consonant clusters, you end up with a lot of syllables that end up sounding the same. Tibetan has gone through this process of starting to have tones. Chinese went through that process much earlier in the history of the development of the language. The Chinese syllable, when you go back to not just the old Chinese, the ancient form, would also have consonant clusters. This is the same way that those that have lost this consonant cluster. You're less able to distinguish words in speech the more that you need multi-syllables to distinguish what a word is. And so Chinese has kind of developed that, especially in modern Mandarin. There are more multiple syllable words in Mandarin than you'll find in some of the more phonologically traditional syllables. Okay, so moving on to tone category. You may have like different spellings in English for the same word. So you could take beat, you could say B-E-A-T, and you could also spell beat as B-E-E-T. Now we understand a beat as something that you can eat. A beat in music is something completely different in meaning. So what you have here are the two words kind of showing up like we would have in the East Asian languages as two categories. However, in English, we do not have a tonal difference. So you basically have to understand what beat I'm talking about when I'm using that word in a sentence. In many of the tonal languages, actually, the tone is different on that word so that you can actually hear that difference. And so there's basically three major categories for words that end in a vowel or a soft consonant like MN or NG. And then if it ends in an occlusive consonant like PTK, that's another fourth category. But those words can also be distinguished quite easily by sound. These words in the fourth category, sometimes, in a lot of languages, their tones will actually match one of the other three categories. But it's really important to understand that of all the language systems that we're going to be looking at, categories one, these languages have four categories. How did the tones actually start to get created? And it really has to do with the onset sound of each syllable. As you can see here, the sounds in the low spectrum, the frequency or the hertz of the voice actually being spoken, those sounds that are like b or bh or m are spoken in a very low frequency because of that voicing. And the ones that come out in a high frequency are p, t, k, or b, d, g. Those are considered high unvoiced consonants, and the others are considered low voiced consonants. And we can separate them into two groups. One is aspirated, and the other is unaspirated. So you'll find the unvoiced consonants in the high class, low voiced consonants in the low class. Now, when we look at Mandarin and we look at the the consonants that begin words that end up in the high class. You have p, t, c, ch, and b, d, z, j, g, k, w, y in the unaspirated group. And you'll notice that W and Y are also included in here. And there's a little anomaly where you have the letter K, which is aspirated, show up in the unaspirated section. In the low voiced, you also have P, T, C, and Ch, and M, N, L, R, W, Y. So the words that begin with these sounds in Mandarin should be showing up in those tonal contours. But Mandarin has evolved a lot over the years, so there will be some changes. Any of you have ever taken a look at the Thai language and started your journey with learning Thai, you'll notice right away, oh, this is something you have to learn in Thai right away. It's like all of these starting consonants have these high, mid, and low classes. And then, where does the mid class fit in? That actually fits in with the high unvoiced, but it's the just below the high class. And there's actually two parts for the low class as well, but Thai doesn't need to differentiate that. Many of the languages don't need to differentiate it. So if you're looking at a language like Vietnamese, you will actually have to differentiate that, especially if you're translating. But you can see here how the voiced sounds are showing up in the mid class, b, d, and j there. And then you have in the low voiced low class, you have m, n. And then, okay, so another thing that you would notice here is that by adding an H to the beginning of the consonant and making a cluster, you can actually pull those low class words all the way up into high class. And another thing to notice about Mandarin is that when you come across a word, by exception, shows up in a high class, like the word ma or n. Some of them are onomatopoeic words, and some of them are just childish words like, mama or they're just particles, but they kind of fall outside of the rules. They don't follow the historical rules of the tone classes. And so if we were to use the Thai writing system, we would add an H in front of those words to let us know, oh, that's now in a high tone. The high, mid, and low class consonants in Thai also applies to all the other languages as well. You just don't really necessarily need to learn it. So why am I talking about it today? Can I give you kind of a history of the tone system across all languages so you understand what you're looking at when you're learning one language or another. I'm going to combine those tone categories we looked at just now with class. What I mean here is that the class is the high class and low class components of this, and then you have the four categories. So I'm just using some example words here like pam, tan, tan, and kang. Pam, tan, tan, gang, and pam, tan. And those are repeated from above because there aren't any voiced. They're now unvoiced. And then in the very bottom row, you have mam, nan, yan, ngang, lan, ran, wang, yan. There's many, many more syllables that are possible here, of course. But in the last column, notice you have the words ending in PTK. So you have pap, tat, tat, kak, pap, tat, tat, gak, and so on. Okay, there's a lot of information presented in my slides. You don't need to memorize this. You can come back and watch it later. The point here is just to give you a general overview. Okay, so if we look at the tone category names, you've probably heard of the phrase yin and yang, which in Chinese is pronounced yin yang, and we apply the yin and yang or the bright and dark sounds. Like the sound of p is kind of a dark sound, so it has the in the high class, and it uses yang or a bright class because when you say the sound like m and d, these are very, very bright sounding sounds. So that's why the low class is called yang, and the high class is called in. Now the four tone categories are called ping, shang, qu, ru. Okay, and so you can see here that I just showed you an example syllable that starts with a P and ends with an M. And in the fourth category, it starts with a P and ends with a P. Okay, so those are just examples of what can show up in these categories. Now, if we look at the universal tone table, what you get is in ping, in shang, in qu, in ru, and then yang ping, yang shang, yang qu, and yang ru. So if we look at animal names in Old Chinese, we just put those onto the table. Every single character in Chinese, actually that character belongs to one of these boxes. It goes into a category. And so you can see here, gay, and then if we consider the shangsheng, because the word itself means upward, I would assume that we don't know what the tonal contours of Old Chinese were, but we could assume that this is an uprising tone. So we could say that this dog is pronounced as go, chicken would be pronounced gay, go, and then tu, the rabbit would probably be a falling tone because it's going away, it's going. So it's tu. So gay, go, tu. This entering tone, we would just consider it a high and a low version of a stopped syllable. So it's just the sparrow is called zhao. Cow would be just the low version of that. So you have flat, rising, falling, and then a short version. So that would be niu, ma, jiang, mi. And so that's basically your 8 tones of Old Chinese. I colored them in the different colors so you can see kind of where these particular words like rabbit and elephant belong into a different category versus the yellow and the green. Because if we go back over here, you'll see that some of them belong in the aspirated class and some belong in the unaspirated class. So the words starting with M and N and L and R, they're going to be in green. And then the ones that start with a fricative consonant are going to be blue. Just going on here. If we look at how the tones in Mandarin line up on this chart, you might be a little bit surprised, but they don't go across the whole chart across 1 to 4. Instead, you have 2 ping tones, so it's 1 and then it goes down to 2, and then 3 and 4 follow on the right. And so that ru sheng category has completely disappeared in Mandarin. So you may be thinking, well, if there were words originally in that category, where are they now? What they've done is they've been borrowed into other categories. We can say that they've migrated or moved into those 4 lasting categories there. Now, the other important thing to notice here is that the tone 1 and tone 2 are the only 2 tones that are in the same category. So when we're looking at the Mandarin tone numbers, we're going to have to learn what their contours are. So the first tone is a high flat tone, or ah. The second tone is a rising tone, or ah. The third tone is a dipping tone, ah. Now, normally we just call this a low falling tone because that's how people speak. You don't have to do the whole dipping and coming back up. So normally you just say ah. It's just a low falling tone. Now, that fourth tone is you got to start really high and come down forcefully. So it's ah. Okay, so again, ah, 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 ah. Now, I just want to let everybody know, I've lived most of my life in Taiwan. I speak Chinese at a near native level, but my Chinese has a Taiwanese tinged accent. I speak according to where I live, which is here in Taiwan. So if we look at the Mandarin tone contours, we apply the tone contours directly onto this universal table, which shows us how these tones line up across all the other languages in East Asia. So you have ah, 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 and ah. Now we could say that the first, second, and third tone categories are ah, ah, and ah. The low version is just ah. And we could say that the other 2 still exist, but they've just merged elsewhere. And in most cases, they've merged upwards. The shangsheng, the X on the bottom row there, is also pronounced as a dipping tone, and then the next one over is also pronounced as a falling tone. Okay, so here's a little example. Using the animal words in Mandarin, you can see here, we go across the graph, we can say that ji, go, tu, and che. Now, notice here that che is pronounced the same way as tu. So we can say that this has migrated over into the chu tone category. And on the second row, you have niu, ma, xiang, and mi. And again, mi is also pronounced in that chu tone category. And you can also see that ma and go are the same, so we can merge them together, move them up. And xiang and tu are also pronounced the same, and we can move them up. So what happens here is that there's an overwhelming amount of words in Mandarin that are pronounced in the 4th tone, and then the 3rd tone just has those 2 tone categories that have merged, and the 1st and 2nd tone are left as they are. Now, so if I just write out all of the tones across a graph like here, there's an alternative way we can look at it. We can say, oh, Mandarin has 13 tones because the Ru tone category in the first box, it has 4 different tone pronunciations, but those 4 pronunciations match some of the other tones. So you could say that every one of these tone boxes some of them have multiple pronunciations. It's just easier if we do it like this. Okay, so this is just for following where all of these words have gone over time. And there's something else I didn't mention here is that if you notice, I'm pronouncing the word shang, the 2nd tone category, shang, in a 3rd tone, and I'm not pronouncing it in a 4th tone like shang, because that's the correct pronunciation of this word in this particular situation. When we talk about tone categories and we say shang, then I'm supposed to say it in the 3rd tone. But as you can see, the word shang itself has moved over into the true tone category and is now pronounced in the 4th tone for all other uses of the word. The only time we use the 3rd tone is when we're talking about the tone category. In case you had learned that word before and you were wondering why I was saying it like that, how can we recognize the ru sheng words that were originally ru sheng in Mandarin? We can do that by looking at the 2nd tone of Mandarin. If you know that The b, d, z, g words in Mandarin cannot appear in the second tone, in the low tone, but yet you see all of these words in Mandarin like bie and guo and de and ze and jie. They all are in that low tone, in that second tone of Mandarin. It means that they have migrated over from what was originally a high tone with an occlusive ending or a PGK ending. That word bie used to be pronounced as bie, and guo as guo, and de as de, and ze as ze, and jie as jie. Okay, so that will also help you recognize these words in other Chinese languages. So most of these languages in southern China, like Yue or Cantonese, Hakka, Min, and Gan, they all will have these kinds of endings, and they also exist in Vietnamese as well. Okay, so let's take a look at the tone patterns in Cantonese. The way we count the tones in Cantonese is by counting them across the row. So 1, 2, 3, and then the second row, 4, 5, 6. And you'll notice that the tones match each other in high and low. So in the high tone, it's and then Now we can also call that ru sung as a 1 because it's a flat tone, but it actually isn't pronounced the same as the first tone because the first tone is sometimes pronounced falling, sometimes as a flat tone. So that's a little bit misleading there. So some systems will count Cantonese all the way up to 9 simply because they're counting the Rusheng tone category, which is and a. Now normally that middle row there, or the 3 or the 8, is usually a long vowel. So you'll notice like words like ba, they're usually pronounced with a long vowel in that category. And that's something we're going to see in the Thai language as well. As you can see on the right side are the tonal contours for each of those tones. Let's look at the animals in Cantonese. As you can see, they all line up and they all have the right kind of tones, and they all fit in those positions pretty nice and neat. So you can say that Cantonese is actually quite a traditional language in the pronunciation. You can see the K on the end of the tsup, and you can see the T on the end of the mat, which tells you that this language has retained a lot of the features of ancient Chinese. Now, the languages of Taiwan, this is where I live. Languages I speak here include Southern Min, or Taiwanese, Hokkien, which is also spoken in the mainland, where you may have heard of Amui or Xiamen, where the Hokkien language is primarily from, and then Hakka, which is spoken in northern Taiwan in what is marked as yellow here on the map. Okay, so looking at the tones in Taiwanese. In Taiwanese, we count them across the tone categories, 1, 2, 3, 4 across, and then the second row, 5, 7, and 8. Now we can say that the 6th tone is never counted in Taiwanese because it has merged with the second tone. It has gone upwards. So you have a, and then a, are how they sound. So you have gui, gao, po, cho. And you have wu, bei, chu, bi. All right, so going on. Tones in Hakka. So Hakka, as you can see, is located in the south, nestled between the Min languages and Yue or Cantonese languages. So in tones in Hakka or Kejia, again, counting, you just count down just like in Mandarin first. So 1, 2, and then you count across 3, 4, 5, and then count down 6. So as you can see, the counting systems in every language can be slightly different. So Hakka looks more like Mandarin with an additional 5 and 6, whereas Taiwanese and Cantonese, Taiwanese counts all the way across, and Cantonese only counts up to the 3rd column and then switches down to the next row. So let's take a look at Shanghai and how they count it. Now, up here at the top, I wrote in Shanghainese, zhonghe, how you pronounce the Shanghainese language. Here you can see they count the first 3 tone categories as 1, 2, and 3, and you can see here that the sang and chu have merged together, and then 4 and 5 are left over. So you get basically 5 tones in Shanghainese. Now, the tones are pretty easy to learn in Shanghainese. If you ever have a desire to learn this language, all you need to do is look at the beginning consonant of the word. The only tone that you really need to mark and remember is the first tone. So if you mark in your own notes, okay, you put an accent on the first letter like I've done here, like ta, ta, and then ta, ta, and then na, because in Shanghainese, they never pronounce the tones like they are right here in isolation. They pronounce them in groups, in clusters. So like when I said the word zhonghe, the zong is pronounced with a z, and we know that the shang is in that low tone category. So it's starting with a low tone, and then the rest of the word kind of goes up to an apex and then falls down to all of the other characters in that word. So it's zhonghe. So the high is actually a high tone. So that's the highest point of this whole word. So in Shanghainese, what you basically get are this high-low contrast. And it begins with the first consonant of the first letter of the compound word. If I were to say a Shanghainese person in Shanghainese, I would say zonghening, zonghening. I would come down real quick on that last character. But since Shanghainese has 4 characters, it's zonghe, it comes down gradually down to the last character. So that's how tones work in Shanghainese. Very easy to learn. All right, so looking at Vietnamese, you'll notice here that the sak tone are the same in the chu and ru categories. It means the ru tone category has merged with the chu tone category in both the high and low. Now, the only thing to notice here is that your low M and L sounds have moved in the ping tone up to the high tone category. So you're actually going to see much fewer words in Vietnamese with that falling tone, the huyen, falling tone. Now, animals in Vietnamese, I'll let you guys look at that on your own time because we've got to move along here. So the tones in Thai, basically you have the same 4-tone contrast here. Thai will have the first tone category unmarked. The second tone and third tone categories will have a 1 and a 2 written above the onset consonant. Now, in Thai, you also have tone categories called 3 and 4, but those are only used for foreign words. So those kind of fall outside the realm of this universal tone system. In the 4th tone category, you have both short and long, which both have their own kind of tone. So you can say that Thai has, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then a middle tone, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 tones, but then again, some of these tones match each other. The only tricky thing there is with Thai is that you learn Thai from the meta system rather than from the tonal contour system, which is how most Chinese languages are taught. So if you understand the universal meta system behind all of these languages, you'll understand how Thai and Chinese line up with each other as well. So there's a lot of examples of this on my blog post called Asian Tones. You can Google just Asian Tones and you can click on the link to the Glossika blog and read more about it and see data for more languages there. So let's go take a look at Mandarin tones in isolation. Now, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but if we use a mnemonic, which is ma, why? If you think about this phrase like, oh, I'm talking to my mother and I'm saying ma, why? Then you basically get the 4 tones of Mandarin. So ma, why, ma. And if you go through that again and again and again in your head and you keep practicing it again and again and again, ma, then you get to the point where those 4 tones are just really, really like second nature to you. Now, of course, it takes time to pick up on what you hear. Training your listening is very core to this as well. The best thing to do is to practice your words in 2-tone combinations. I can't tell you how many times I've met somebody who says they come from the United States and they call themselves 美国人 in Chinese because 美国, it sounds something like a berry fruit. Some sort of a strawberry or a blueberry fruit. And it just sounds so silly, like you're supposed to say 美国人. So that's why it's really, really key to really focus on your listening because your listening will create ruts in your brain and those ruts will grow deeper and deeper and deeper. And then you're just stuck in a rut and your tones will always be in that rut. And it's just very, very easy to be in that position. So I would suggest training your tones in 2-tone combinations and then 3-tone combinations. And then we'll go on and look at prosody a little bit later. So, 医生收集中等车票. Now, here's a funny sentence you can put together into a sentence. The doctor collects mid-class tickets. 医生收集中等车票. And then you can put 2-character words into a sentence and you get the first tone combinations there. The second tone combinations, 来宾急忙结果迟到. So you put this together into a sentence, a silly sentence. A guest who hastes results in tardiness. So 来宾急忙结果迟到. And then you can get that. I think if you practice this into a sentence form, you kind of get a feeling for using each one of those tones properly. Okay, the next example using the 3rd tone, 普通老人可否忍受. Now, if I put it together in a sentence, my voice isn't going to be that dramatic. So it's just 普通老人可否忍受. Can common elders, are common elders able to tolerate? Okay, so just kind of a funny meaning here, but okay, the teacher proves that the mayor cheats. Okay, so 教师证明市长作弊. Again, 教师证明市长作弊. So then just remember that your fourth tone has to come down forcefully from the top of your voice all the way down. So 教师证明市长 or 市长. You can just let it fall. Yeah, 市长. And then 作弊. All right, so when you have two fourth tones together, you really got to come all the way back up to the top and then drop down again. So 作弊. So you can download our Chinese pronunciation and tone training handbook. It has audio included, and there are also 64 three-tone combinations, and you really should practice all of them. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide, and I just want to make the point that Mandarin is becoming more stress time in its pronunciation. So if we put the first, second, and third, fourth tone at the end of a phrase and then practice saying that phrase, for those of you who have already learned some Mandarin, this would be for you, not for the absolute beginner. But let's take a look at this. So, 你能不能收? Notice how I say that middle part with the verb, 能不能, it just glides over it really quickly. So, 你能不能收? 你能不能来? 你能不能给? 你能不能去? Again, one more time. 你能不能收? 你能不能来? 你能不能给? 你能不能去? Okay, let's try with another phrase. 我还没叫你收，我还没叫你来，我还没叫你给，我还没叫你去. Okay, so I haven't told you to collect or come or go or give. Okay, so that's what the phrase means. Okay, another way to practice is by putting it in, contrasting the first, second, third, fourth tone near the end of the sentence where you're going to be adding an unstressed ending. So 我已经装好了，我已经装好了，我已经拿好了，我已经拿好了。我已经转好了. So your third tone has to change to a second tone here. So 我已经转好了，我已经记好了，我已经记好了. All right, so weak pronouns in causative phrases. So, these pronouns in particular, they lose a lot of their pronunciation, just like you would have in English where you say the word better, especially in a North American accent, where the T becomes like a flap. Sometimes when you say the word important, you don't really hear the T in that word at all. If you speak with more of a glottal stop in British English, you would probably be more accustomed to saying better rather than better. Let's go ahead and take a look at this. 把它丢上去，把它丢上去. When I say 把它, the ta here kind of loses its aspirated T sound. So it's 把它丢上去, 把它丢上去. And so this happens a lot in English as well. So it should come naturally. 让它掉下来. Here you can hear my ta kind of sounding like a na. So 让它掉下来, 让它掉下来. Because it's kind of being assimilated with that previous word. 叫他过来, 叫他过来. Again, here's a vowel connecting with the ta, so it weakens. 叫他过来, 叫他下去拿. Okay, and the next one, 帮他拿过来, 帮他拿过来. And the final one, 帮我把它拆掉, 帮我把它拆掉. Now, of course, in my translation, I'm using get it, because we have this phrase a lot in English where we say have it be done or get it done. So it's not a really great translation here, but it kind of shows you how the 把它 is being used in Chinese here. So 帮我把它拆掉, 帮我把它拆掉. So here you can hear every time that I say the word ta, it has a slightly different pronunciation. The allophones come out differently in each situation, which gives you an idea of how that works with those weak pronouns. Now, again, the weak pronouns is the same like you're going to see in Spanish or Italian. They come after the verb. They're pronounced. They're never accented or stressed. And it's kind of the same thing here. But you still need to keep their tone, of course. But the consonants in the word are, they weaken. And so you'll notice that a lot in Chinese, in fast speech, and with all kinds of phrases that there's a lot of words that may become, like the onset consonants may become voiced, or they may become flaps, or they may become nasalized. Some of these alternations are happening in natural speech, and you just need to, if you're not feeling it yet, you just haven't had enough experience with the language, and you just need to do more of it. You can sign up and train Chinese on Glossika. We have both mainland accents and Taiwan accents, practicing sentences and full sentences. I'm going to go directly to the questions. Any recommendations for which apps are especially good for learning Chinese? I've been learning with Memrise and I really like it. Just interested in what else is helpful. To tell you the truth, I haven't used any apps for learning Chinese, particularly because I've been speaking the language for most of my life since the mid-90s. And I've been living in Taiwan most of my life. And so as time has gone on, there's been many, many apps that have come out, and I just haven't really taken a look at them. What are some suggestions for overcoming the intimidation of tonal languages? And I think it's the same thing for any language, is that if you can't hear the sounds of that language coming in like a clear radio broadcast, then that language, you just haven't spent enough time with it. Those words should be coming into your ears, into your head so crystal clear, like you're hearing your own accent in your own language. And that's how it should sound. I have the same problem with lots and lots of languages. It's just because I just haven't had enough experience and time listening to that language. So that's my number one suggestion, is that you need to listen to your own pronunciation. Because once that clicks into place, and it really does click, you should be hearing all of the mistakes you're making in your own speech generation. You should pursue fixing those. What I do is that if I accidentally say a word wrong, I just stop for a second, take a deep breath, and I switch back into crystal clear Chinese intonation. Okay, pronunciation appears to be a hard one to crack even for year-long learners. Why is that? Phonology in the temporal domain feels even harder. Tones, phonemic lengths. I would say focus less on the phonemic and more on the phonetic. And that's kind of what I was going over right here, was these sound changes hearing. How the tas change into allophones, and that might be affecting your listening. It might be affecting the way you sound. Maybe you sound too robotic if you're using all of your tones like a dictionary pronunciation, or you're pronouncing all of your pronouns overstressed. That's going to lead to those kinds of problems. So focus on the phonetic aspects of the pronunciation. And phonetic just means the narrow transcription in IPA terms of how that language is sounded. It includes the allophones. So if you're learning in Beijing, you want to learn those stick with one variety. If you're learning in Taipei, stick with that variety and learn it well. Try not to mix up with a bunch of different varieties. It might be helpful for learning, for training your listening for lots of different dialects, but I really, really suggest you stick with one and learn one really well, so that when you speak, people won't be too confused. And I think I already answered this question, the other aspects of this question. So thank you guys for listening, and thank you for your questions.